So, back in 1989, the weird and wacky world of Formula One was undergoing a little bit of a change. After having used turbocharged V6 engines for the last few years, it was now decided that turbos were the devil's work, and that 3.5-litre naturally aspirated engines were the way to go. V8s, V10s, whatever you wanted. Well, whatever you can make work up to 12 cylinders anyway. And so long as you had air plugs handy, this was the best news that any diehard of the world could possibly wish for. For teams and manufacturers, this was also welcomed with open arms. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Well, you're all here now, so you know that these rule changes brought about the birth of a truly horrific creature. So, how? When? Why? Who? Which? Somewhere in the hills of Italy, Franco Rocci was happily enjoying retirement, painting canvases and eating his slippers. It was a far cry from what he had done for a career, designing and building some of the greatest engines that Ferrari had ever made, at least right before they blew themselves up. But he was happy here. It seemed that nothing, not even Enzo Ferrari himself, could lure this man away from retirement. But I guess there is some truth to the saying, every man has his price. And what better to exploit that than an eccentric Italian businessman? Enter Ernesto Vita, a man whose silver tongue is so compelling he could sell salt to a slug. Vita rocked up to Rocci's house with a simple proposal.
So, Formula One have these new regulations. I hear you have designs for the W12 engine and, all these teams are going to want such an engine. How's about coming out of retirement and turning them designs into reality? Could be quite lucrative,
To which Rocci, with his years of wisdom and experience, knowledge about the pitfalls that come with business, replied, yeah, it. Why not? And so with Rocci shanghaied into service, Mr. Vita's plan was simple. Produce Rocci's W12 engines, sell them to teams up and down the Formula One paddock, and reap the profits. Because of course, if there is one thing that embodies the ethos of speed and reliability, it's an experimental engine that's been designed by a retired painter, produced in Italy, and financed by a businessman who's more used to selling counterfeit Armani jackets out of a container in Naples. Yeah. Needless to say, no one in Formula One land was interested in buying these engines. And so, by the end of 1989, Vita was left with a bunch of engines, no buyers, and a lot of debt. A logical choice, perhaps, would be to liquidate all that he had and go back to whatever it was before he did all of this. Instead, he decided,
you know what? If they ain't gonna buy them and they're just sitting there, then I'll just set up my own team and run them in there.
Logic. So, he bought a factory near Modena and bought a whole bunch of computers and dynos to help speed up development of the engines. Of course, those engines were gonna need a car to be put in, and they didn't have a car right now. But, as luck would have it, there was a Formula One team that was looking to sell their own. And so, Vita purchased the F189 chassis from First Racing. Is this the first time you've ever heard of them? Well, that's okay, because there is a reason why no one has ever heard of them. But it was a starting point, and with former Ferrari engineer Gianni Morelli brought in to spruce the car up and make the W12 engine fit in it, the car would be ready for the 1990 Formula One season. The chassis now called the L190, and the team's name being a literal English translation of Vita's name, Life. The irony that was about to follow. So, the first round was in Phoenix, Arizona. For Life Racing's first foray into Formula One, they were gonna have to pre-qualify with the rest of the peasants. 9 drivers would go in, but only 4 would come out. From the outset, things did not look all that promising. First off, yeah, the car was technically ready to race, but just a couple of months ago, when it was bought from that first racing team we talked about, it had failed compulsory crash tests set by the FIA. What's more, the car's designer, Riccardo Davila, described it as nothing more than an interesting flower pot, which might be the least inflammatory slander that I've ever heard in my life, but hey, to each his own. And he hated his creation so much that he went so far as to take legal action to make sure that his name was never connected to this car again, which is why he's been mentioned here live and in living color on this video. So congrats, Barbara Streisand. Not bad enough that its own designer had disowned it. Finding a competent enough driver to pilot this thing was gonna be tricky. Anyone reputable was either already taken or not stupid enough to drive this death trap. Because of the low side pods and cockpit made out of tracing paper, you would have to be one desperate dude to put yourself into this thing. The team's test driver, Franco Scapini, was denied an FIA super license, which back in the 1990s I didn't even think was possible, but eventually they did find someone to drive the car for that first pre-qualifying session in Arizona, signing that driver to a 2-year deal. Problem was, that driver was Gary Brabham. If you don't know why that's a terrible, dreadful, awful thing, let Google become your worst nightmare. In order for the Life to get into the race, Brabham would have needed to set a 133.331 or better better. But he wouldn't do that. In fact, he wouldn't get anywhere near it. After a sum total of 4 laps, thanks to the electronics going native and setting themselves on fire, he set a time of 2:07.147, nearly 35 seconds off the mark. What makes this worse was that this wasn't some Mickey Mouse result. That was actually how slow it was. So what the hell's going on? Well, it was the heaviest car in the field. It was unable to cool itself even when it was turned off, and also there was the very reason why these geezers were here in the first place. The engine. It was Rochi's lifelong dream, I think, to produce a W12 engine that had all the power in the world, whilst also being about the size of a V8 engine. Now, I'm not an engineerist, so I couldn't tell you exactly what his grand master plan was, but what I can say is this. In race specification, the Honda V10 engine used by McLaren at the time could churn out about 710 horsepower, whereas the Life W12 could only muster 375 horsepower, which is fine in a motorized pencil sharpener, not so much in a Formula 1 car that already had enough problems as it was. At the next round in Brazil, the engine produced even less power when it blew itself apart before even completing a lap of qualifying. After this debacle, Gary Brabham never raced in Formula 1 again, and for that, we ought to owe this car and its engine our thanks. By this time, other personnel began leaving the team of their own accord en masse. I mean, who could blame them? When you turn up with virtually no spare parts and a car that can't even match lap times of Formula 3 cars, what exactly is the end goal here? They were laughed at, ridiculed. No one wanted to be with them, no one wanted to sponsor them, and no one wanted to drive for them. No one. Except for Bruno Giacomelli. To a lot of people, this was a shock. Giacomelli was a reputable driver. His drive in Las Vegas a few years ago made him the greatest driver to have ever been a living organism. But here, when even the Steven Seagals of motor racing wouldn't even touch it, he would dare stand up to the task, and he hadn't even driven in Formula 1 since 1983. What gives? Well, he said he was interested in the W12 engine designed by Rochi, liar, and in general, he just wanted to help the team out, give them the benefit of his years of experience and expertise. I mean, there was that, and Mr. Vita did promise him tens of thousands of dollars per race, so yeah. Money talks. But there might have been something genuine about that. He probably did want to see the team get better, to improve. And improve they did. In his first pre-qualifying event at Imola, Giacomelli wasn't 35 seconds slower than the cutoff time. The gap was 5 minutes and 47 seconds. The culprit? A drive belt for the water and oil pump had run away, meaning Giacomelli never went beyond 3rd gear. No, really. As the season went on, the car was unacceptably slow, never getting within 10 seconds of qualifying for a race. Giacomelli lived in constant fear that someone was going to run into the back of him. Such was the lack of pace in this thing, and it definitely wasn't helped by the complete lack of funding for the team. While the likes of McLaren had a budget of around about 25 million euros to play with, Mr. Vita funded his team to the tune of 50,000 euros, and whatever he happened to find stuffed under the couch. He needed to find more money for the team, and eventually, he did. But there was something wrong with it, wasn't there? Yes, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, but there was still copious amounts of money just yearning to be dumped into landfill-bound Italian hunks of metal, and even 30 years later, that was still the case. Petersburg Industrial Company's chairman, Mikhail Pushkovsky, was himself a racing enthusiast, and when seeing life's funding problems in Formula 1, he went to Mr. Vita and asked, "How much money you guys got?" 50,000 euros? Well, how does 10 to 15 million sound to you? Of course, who could possibly turn that down? Even if it does mean slapping the red banner on your car. Even if it does mean selling your soul to the devil. Even if it does mean that once again, it was all a fugazi. The millions never transpired. The company only ever giving Life F1 enough money to buy an engine that would not self-detonate. Of course, this meant ditching the W12 engine that had caused all the fuss in the first place. Even Rochi had to admit that his darling creation was nothing more than a problem child from the very moment that it became a sentient being. Now the team had acquired a good reliable engine in the form of a Judd V8, which, as it turned out, was also kinda broken from the moment they bought it. They legally threatened the Leighton House team they bought it from, who in turn threw up their hands and said, Alright, we'll fix it. Chill the f*** out. The team had no spare parts, a car that couldn't qualify if it was the only one racing, and almost no one on the payroll. In fact, even those on the payroll weren't really being paid that much at all. Giacomelli was promised a wad of money per race, but guess how much he actually got paid by season's end? I'll give you just a couple of seconds to guess. Take your time. You guessed it yet? By now, other teams in the paddock viewed them as a joke. So much so that the big little man of Formula One himself, Bernie Ecclestone, a man normally all about uniting the teams all together as one big happy family back then, went to Ernest de Vita and essentially said, "You might want to give this up, mate." Of course, they didn't. Not without a fight anyway. In just 2 weeks, they had rebuilt the car and fit the Judd V8 into it, hoping for a better result in Portugal. But the Looney Tunes weren't over yet. Thanks to that new engine, the engine cover didn't fit properly, and halfway through the session, it just flew away and threw them out of the weekend. At the next round at Spain, it still wound up 18 seconds slower than the qualifying cutoff time, and even with a totally different engine, it still made the same blow-uppy effects that the W12 did. Eventually, the writing was on the walls. The Life F1 team didn't bother turning up for the last 2 rounds in Japan and Australia, the team just abruptly ending operations and Mr. Vita fading into obscurity. In all its time, the L190 never even got close to qualifying, never even got close to the next slowest car ahead of them. It was undeniably the worst Formula One car ever made, and so the moral of the story is that life sucks. Anyways, thank you all for watching.